Today we will talk about a character from the twilight of Tsarist Russia, surrounded by rumors of miraculous powers, debauchery, alcoholism, and perversion, amid the suspicion he caused to the royalty and clergy of Russia. An incredible story filled with prophecies and occultism about common and literate. A peasant from the wild Siberian fields ends up penetrating the most intimate maritime circles of the Tsarist nobility. After receiving a divine call and making a pilgrimage from where he is reborn as a mystical man with seemingly supernatural powers, he manages to get the Emperor and Empress of Russia to put the successor to the throne, and therefore the empire itself, in his hands. This is about Rasputin, perhaps the most recognized name in the history of that country, the subject of countless biographies, novels, plays, musical operas, liquors, songs, and much more. Join us to learn his story. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 under new leadership has brought about a rethinking of characters and historical events in Russian national life. A demonstration of this is the treatment of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandra Romanov, who, from being brutally executed by the Bolsheviks and despised under the Soviet regime, were canonized as saints by the Russian Orthodox Church in the year 2000, Rasputin has not been forgotten in this process of reevaluating Russian history. Painted as the personification of popular peasant faith, who had to pay with his life the envy of the court, which despised him for his humble origins. However, history is never as simple or unambiguous as it seems. Rasputin was born in Pokrovskoye in Siberia, a poor village with a peasant economy, in a region that forever served as a penal colony, since Ivan the Terrible's reign. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was born on January 21, 1869. Very little is actually known about Rasputin's early years. As we will see, the issues that made him such an extraordinary character. They are more due to palace rumors, gossip, and court circles and yellow press than to facts that can be verified. There is no way to accurately determine the real or fictitious nature of much of what is known about him. What is certain is that there is no Rasputin without a story about him. At the time when Rasputin lived in Siberia, the region was ruled by military governors appointed by the Tsar. Siberia was always a route for merchants seeking quick wealth for crooks, robbers, and other criminals. Just as agricultural products were traded, so were human beings and alcohol. So violence was a daily occurrence that all the inhabitants of this area were used to. Baptized by his parents as Grigory, in honor of Saint Gregory of Nyssa, a 4th century Christian mystic celebrated by the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, Rasputin was the son of Orthodox Christian peasants. Yefim and Anna were his parents, and Rasputin was, along with another girl, one of the 7 siblings who managed to live beyond, at the age of 5. He lives and matures like the peasants, experiencing the warm summers and harsh winters of the era. In the village, he works with his father and from a very young age develops a taste for liquor. At 17 years old in 1886, he leaves his native village and travels thousands of kilometers to a town called Avalak, where he meets a peasant woman named Praskovia, a hard-working, submissive, and loyal woman. He courts her for several months and they marry in February 1887. Together, they have 7 children, but only 3 survive. After getting married, Rasputin takes his wife to live at his parents' house, as was the Orthodox custom. Rasputin always took care of her and his wife was devoted to him until his death. She tolerated his vices, excesses, and the rumors circulating about him. Things were going as usual in Pokrovskoye, until in 1897, a man who seemed destined to live a peasant life undergoes a religious conversion at the age of 28. Whether it was to overcome his pronounced alcoholic habit or, as he later recounted, his insomnia and enuresis, Rasputin begins to make brief pilgrimages to monasteries, is dragged out of churches for causing disturbances during service, and is impressed by the wisdom of older men. Rasputin develops a certain disdain for the monastic life he was able to see tangentially. He considers the elements of the clergy as rigid, coercive, and even aberrant, dressed in a cassock. Then he joins, according to the stories, a Christian cult condemned by the Orthodox Church. This cult preached pain, on one hand, to achieve faith, but also parties and orgies were normal as religious rites. Rasputin is becoming a spiritual man. His life as a pilgrim was tough. He walked about 50 kilometers daily, begged for alms, and fasted from water and food for several days. He didn't bathe or change his clothes. He walked with shackles that destroyed his ankles, assuming a martyrdom that he said would free him from his old sins and bring him closer to the Spirit of Christ. Until, either due to ulcers or for comfort, he abandons the metal chains for once of faith. He learns to read the Gospels, to contemplate their meaning and find God in all things, especially in the beauty of the Russian fields. His knowledge of the Russian social order was extensive, and his understanding of human psychology was profound. Rasputin, through his travels, learns to read people and tell them what managed to comfort them. Whether he was inspired by a pilgrim who visited his village, named Milady Zaborovsky, or by an apparition he had of the Virgin Mary and Saint Simeon, such conversion transforms him into a wandering pilgrim who never studies theology or becomes a priest. But with his charisma, wisdom, and ability to preach the Holy Scriptures, he manages to attract a significant number of followers. After his pilgrimage, Rasputin returns to Pokrovskoye, a changed and disheveled man who behaves differently than he used to. He became a vegetarian, stopped drinking liquor for a while, and prayed and sang with great fervor. During that time, he learned fishing, efficient livestock care, and farm work in exchange for food. The pilgrim develops an ability to persuade and read people in order to advise them on their problems and gain their trust. As a result, he gains many admirers. Many of them were women with whom he would occasionally overstep boundaries, with whom he would get intimate and manipulate to extract money and goods that he would then exchange to cover his daily expenses. Similarly, he develops what was interpreted as healing powers to cure people of all kinds of ailments and diseases. He had a very steady and penetrating gaze. He had brown hair but light blue eyes. An eloquent and ambivalent verb that made him look like an oracle to others. In the midst of this life of work and religious preaching, Rasputin is accused by the local authorities of having stolen, one, of having violated a woman, so he flees from Pokrovskoye. Part of the problem in pinpointing exact dates, like those of this event, is largely due to Rasputin himself, who was always changing. The stories, the testimonies, the dates, the places, and the characters at the convenience of whoever asked him. After fleeing, Rasputin ends up in St. Petersburg, a city at that time steeped in the occult and the supernatural. It was also said that he resumed his life of sexual and alcoholic excesses. Spiritualism sessions were a trend of the time, along with hypnotism, palmistry, and telepathy, arts widely practiced by people that Rasputin meets in bars and places with which he becomes familiar by learning occult arts. This search for spirituality coincides with the belief that hidden and evil forces were lurking in a Russia that was beginning to experience profound changes, just like the rest of the world. Industrialization, liberal revolutions, the rejection of God as the center of human life, the rise of communism. These were winds that also reached Russia. The future Emperor of Russia, Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov, noticed Princess Alex of Hesse when he was 12 years old. Granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England, Alex of Hesse, the heiress of the Grand Duke of Hesse in Germany, would later be known as Alexandra Romanov, the name she adopted after converting to Russian Orthodoxy. Queen Victoria of England desperately wanted an arranged marriage for Alex of Hesse, but she was not attracted to the idea of being Queen of England. In Queen Victoria's correspondence, she commented that if she were to marry a Russian nobleman, Alex of Hesse, she would not find happiness but the tragedy she felt. A premonition that a terrible fate awaited her. As we'll later discover, her prediction proved accurate. The 1st of November, 1894, the father of Nicholas Romanov, Emperor Alexander III, dies in his palace in Crimea, and it is an inexperienced Nicholas who must take over the leadership of the vast Russian Empire. On November 2nd, 1894, Alex of Hesse, under his new name, the one that remained for history, Alexandra Fyodorovna receives her first communion under the Russian Orthodox Church. And on November 26th, she marries Tsar Nicholas Romanov at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Theirs was fundamentally a happy marriage, filled with love and loyalty for each other, which lasted until the end of their days, in the face of Soviet bullets and bayonets. This does not mean that their lives were happy, because from the first day, Alexandra was irritated by the pressures of being Lazarina. Despite her position that made her a public figure with defined obligations to her new subjects, Alexandra chooses to live a quiet life away from public scrutiny, treating her children's privacy as if they were German nobles away from Russia. And the privacy she longed for only made her feel isolated, lonely, and unloved. So she didn't understand why the other members of the Romanov family spoke ill of her, even in her presence without the slightest decorum. As a result, the Tsarina exiles some Russian nobles and royals from the palace, something that would bring devastating consequences for the throne. Because from these resentments, as we will see, courtiers and nobles allied themselves with elements of Freemasonry and eventually with Bolshevism, born in a bloody revolution. For his part, Tsar Nicholas, unable to make her see the problems it brought to his reign, devoted himself to pressuring her for a single responsibility that would give him a male heir to the throne to guarantee the succession. Over 6 years, between 1895 and 1901, Alexandra gave birth to 4 girls, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, but no boys. The royal court and the country were losing patience. We were missing the comments that a curse had fallen on the family, and it is in that anguish that Rasputin would later have his moment. In the Russian royal family, there were 2 unique members, Milika and Anastasia, daughters of the King of Montenegro, who were among the few who got along well with Tsarina Alexandra. They were known as the Dark Princesses because of their fascination with occultism, which was rampant in Russia and fascinated the upper classes of that country, who, between hypnotism, telepathy, palmistry, and other mystical practices, had an escape from the constant political turmoil, industrial changes, and the unrest of chaos. The Dark Princesses introduced the royal couple to a series of witches and mystics who promised that, with their services, Tsarina Alexandra could finally give birth to a male child. Around that time, a Frenchman named Philippe, a butcher's apprentice self-proclaimed doctor, was making waves among occult circles, and he enters the intimate orbit of Nicholas and Alexandra, causing great concern among the nobles. Nicholas entrusts him with state matters that he did not entrust to his ministers. Alexandra begins to gain weight and is presumed pregnant, but she wasn't. The matter becomes public and is made to look as if Alexandra had a miscarriage. Frustrated, the royal couple expels the Frenchman, who prophetically tells a sad and lonely Alexandra that another man would come in his place to help her. By 1904, at the age of 35, already Rasputin in St. Petersburg was famous for being a healer and a religious man with supernatural powers. This notoriety put him on course to meet with Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, who were still looking for a miracle in the form of an heir. In July of 1904, after a decade of attempts, the Tsarina finally gives birth to her son Alexei, heir to the throne. But this would be a Pyrrhic joy, because the miracle-made child and future of the dynasty. He suffered from a serious hereditary disease on his mother's side, hemophilia, a disorder that prevents blood clotting, which made him vulnerable to potentially lethal bleeding from minor injuries such as stumbles or falls. The Romanovs, with their deep pockets, sought the best doctors from around the world to treat him, but science at that time had no answers for treating this disease. The interest in the welfare of their beloved son and the future of the kingdom leads the Heirs to seek all kinds of healers, spiritualists, or metaphysical solutions. Nicholas and Alexandra go from desperately wanting a child to desperately wanting their child to be healthy. After being scammed, they constantly hear word of mouth that there is a man named Rasputin, famous for being a healer, whom the Tsar describes in his diary, I quote, like a man of God. But Rasputin, between that bandit and faith life, seemed to be tired of the metropolis. He returned to drinking, to women, to excesses, and he goes back for short periods to Siberia. In these comings and goings, he becomes known among some members of the nobility circle, including the Dark Princesses, who are the ones who introduce him to Nicholas Romanov, on November 1 of 1905 in the Peterhof Palace to this strange man of Siberian origin. The Tsar records that presentation in his diary, but it would be a few months before they meet again, because the Tsar summons him in July of 1906, and he introduces him to the Tsarina and their 4 daughters and their only son in November and October of that year. Rasputin told the Tsars that they should trust in God and his miracles, that they should trust in authority, delivered from the heavens, to Nicholas to rule Russia, at a time when the country was going into rebellion against the monarchy and Nicholas had to demand obedience from his subjects, because the health of the Tsar and his heir were inseparable from the health of Russia. Rasputin, for reasons that remain the subject of speculation, whether by hypnosis, some unexplained supernatural method, or any unknown reason, he manages to stop Alexei's bleeding and temporarily heal him of his hemophilia, and also calms the anxieties of the princesses and the Tsarina. He ends up being a doctor and advisor to the family with special closeness to the heir child. So the royal couple gives him a condominium a few blocks from the palace, very luxurious. A scandalous move among the nobles who start meeting with masons and occultists to plot against Rasputin. His scandalous behavior with the ladies of high society and prostitutes, his indecorous intimacy with the royal family, and his enormous influence over politics. Getting to supervise. The appointments of the Tsarina, when the Tsar was absent due to war, had the effect of eroding the authority of Tsarism among the nobles. The Tsarina also trusts the predictions of the Siberian monk about the destinies of Holy Russia, which Rasputin saw. In his visions, I open quotes, wrapped in a black cloud and immersed in a deep and painful sea of tears. Rumors arise that Rasputin and Tsarina Alexandra were lovers. However, these rumors did not have a solid foundation. But they spread so much that postcards depicting them in sexual encounters were openly circulated. Tsar Nicholas was repeatedly warned, but it was a crowd. The problems he had in a tumultuous Russia that was about to enter a world war. Tsar Nicholas appreciated the calming effect that Rasputin had on his anxious wife and his sick son. He told his prime minister, better 10 Rasputins than one of the empress's hysterical attacks. However, once the aura of the Tsar was broken, the revolution became inevitable. The monk had privileges like few others, and from there arise those rumors that became legend and make him a colorful character of fantastic tales. For example, although it is true that Rasputin had access to the princesses' rooms when they were in their nightclothes, something that not even the princesses' governesses were authorized to do, there is no way to prove that he had any inappropriate sexual contact with them or with Tsarina herself. Partly because Alexandra was a Victorian with puritanical behavior, and Rasputin, a man with the manners of a barnyard animal. The truth is that it is almost unbelievable how a man who embraced a strange religious sect that practiced the most bizarre forms of sexual perversions convinces to be some kind of saint to the emperor and empress, and manages to get into their bosom as a spiritual guide, with a power that rivaled that of the Russian Orthodox Church, which eventually kneels before his designs. Everyone in the Tsar circle advised him and his family to stay away from that man. From his prime minister to the head of Tsarist intelligence, Nicholas would receive tracking reports of the sordid sexual adventures and bacchanals of that Siberian peasant, of which the monarch simply pays no attention. The excesses continued for years, but Alexei, the heir to the throne, was relatively stable, and that was what really mattered to the Tsar. While in the world the dissolution of feudalism, industrialization, and revolutionary movements were crying out for equality and freedom, reached the Tsarist bureaucracy that made political concessions, but did not fully satisfy the reformers and agitators. In July of 1914, what was known as the First World War broke out, throwing Russia into a conflict that would serve as a prologue to the fall of the Tsarist throne. Meanwhile, in Russia, a couple of days before the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, a follower of Rasputin stabs him in the stomach in Siberia in revenge for an alleged sexual assault. Severely injured, he undergoes surgery and recovers. He informs the Tsar via letter that he survived an assassination attempt but won't survive the next one. A group of Russian nobles who met with Freemasons, with communist Jews disguised as reformists, and with occultists, led by the Grand Duke, Dmitry Pavlovich, and Prince Felix Yusupov, they grew tired of Rasputin's influence over the Tsar. And they decide, on December 17th of 1916, to carry out a plot in which they would have the monk go to Prince Yusupov's house in the Moika Palace. Under the offer of a dinner, women, and drink, Rasputin arrives at the site. They feed him poisoned buns, sweets, and tea with cyanide. However, after a while, the poison does not end up having any effect on Rasputin. Frustrated, Yusupov and Pavlovich decide to violently attack him, and Rasputin fiercely defends himself. They stab him again with a dagger, and Puriskevich, another conspirator present in the plot, fires a gun 3 times. Rasputin, badly wounded with several shots on him, beats up his attackers, flees the palace, but collapses on the snow, a few meters from the place. The conspirators wrap his body in blankets, drive a vehicle to the Petrovsky Bridge, and throw him into the Malaya Nevka River. His body was found shortly after, and apparently they found signs that Rasputin was still struggling in the river. Rasputin was buried on January 2nd, 1917, in a cemetery at Tarskovia Selo Church, at a funeral attended only by royalty, leaving out his wife, his children, and his lovers. However, after the Russian Revolution that dethroned Tsar Nicholas from the monarchy, his body was exhumed and cremated by a detachment of soldiers so that his grave would not become a meeting place for the Tsar's followers. Recent investigations even suggest that the British Secret Service was involved in Rasputin's murder through an agent who was then residing in Petrograd named Oswald Reiner, under the command of another agent named John Skell, who directly participated in the homicide. In Russia, the revolutionaries and the Bolsheviks end up overthrowing the monarchy and the entire royal family, including the young Tsarevich Alexei. They would end up being executed in the most cowardly and bloody way, thus fulfilling Rasputin's predictions of the painful Sea of Tears, portrayed as the false image of a demon who knew how to exploit the weaknesses of the elements close to the monarchy. The campaign against Rasputin, carried out by anti-monarchist elements, was nothing more than a war against the Tsarist monarchy and against Holy Russia itself, whose aura of sacredness around the throne was being undermined. A matter that, combined with liberal elements, Masons, and radicals of a nascent communist political trend, would bring about the fall of the Romanov dynasty at the hands of a band of atheists ethnically adverse to Russian orthodoxy and to its traditions. It was said that his wickedness, as well as his sexual drive, had no limits, that he was a brutal satyr, drunk with the manners of a barnyard animal. But on the other hand, his audacity, his eloquence, his peasant wisdom, and his healing powers that have no material explanation. Today they made him present himself as the man of God before the Tsar and the Tsarina, making them believe that he could save Alexei, the heir to the throne, and the entire Russian dynasty. In short, the story of Rasputin is one of tragedy, not only of a man but of an entire nation, because in his life, plagued with struggles and questions about faith, morality, pleasure, and sin, about duties, powers, and responsibilities, and in his bloody end can we discern the history of Russia itself at the beginning of the 20th century. Reynaldo Carrillo spoke to them. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I ask you to support us by leaving your comment, liking it, interacting with the video in any way, sharing it with your acquaintances, and following us on our Instagram account, also called The New Encyclopedia.